Today we're talking about Warlock's Sash. Excuse me, Warlock's Staff. It's been changed. Not only the name, but also quite a few stats about the item. I'm gonna read the patch notes part quickly as a reminder, and then we'll discuss this a little further. Warlock's Sash, now Staff, is seeing a slight early game shift. This item has some pacing problems that the recent Conquest changes made worse. With a longer laning phase, the initial health provided too much safety too soon. However, Warlocks still needed to scale into the later stages of the game, and mages need additional magical power with the change to Rod of Tahuti. To resolve both issues at once, we are decreasing its initial health and increasing its magical power, and the health will still scale to the same amount as before. Change this item's name and icon to Warlock's Staff. Decreased base health from 300 to 200. Increased magical power from 50 to 75. Increased scaling health from passive from 3 HP to 4 per stack. What stats does this give us in total? Unstacked Warlock's Staff costs 2650 gold, has 75 power, 200 health and 400 mana. Stacked Warlock's Staff still costs 2650 gold, what a surprise, has 135 power, 600 health and 400 mana. So the stacked version of this item gets a 25 power increase flat, same as the unstacked version basically, but in case of the stacked version there is no down trade to that, whereas the unstacked version loses 100 health. Now if we're talking about mages, 100 health versus 25 power is an interesting discussion to begin with. If you're assuming a god that has 100% flat scaling on an ability, which wouldn't really exist, but if that was the case, then we would have an even trade between 4 abilities and 100 health, roughly. That is not the case though. Most abilities have a decent chunk of base damage, especially in the early game, that is more impactful than the scaling until later on, and scaling often is less than 100% as well. That means that 25 power will overall do even less in comparison. So the benefit is maybe made up after roughly 6 abilities. But that's not the key part here. The key part is that early power allows for early clear, and the overall pressure that you can get with that is usually more impactful for a mid laner, a mage, than the health is anyways. Yes, the health is nice for survivability, and having a little bit of it is very beneficial, but it's not like you absolutely only build this item to be tanky. You still want to get the power at the later point. It's just more an investment into stacking, into survivability in the long run. And actually, Warlock's Sash wasn't even underbought at all. If you look at the SPL games, there were 2 items that were frequently bought. One was Doom Orb for those very aggressive mages that really wanted that early push, and the other one was Warlock's Sash for those mages who were kind of more towards late game or who had kind of a bit of trouble against whatever they were laning against and who was in the jungle and all that kind of stuff. It is understandable to me that Warlock's Sash needs some changes coming into the upcoming season, because in the upcoming season many things are slowed down for a while and then they speed up quite a fair bit, so stacking may feel different. I don't think it's harder or easier or anything, I'm just saying it feels different. But what's important here is what we end up with outside of the void that is just Warlock's Staff as itself. If we look at other items in comparison, things become quite interesting and maybe a little bit questionable. Because there is another stacking item out there, Book of Thoth. And Book of Thoth costs 2650 gold as well, so they should be somewhat equal in value that they provide for you, right? Well, Book of Thoth, assuming we start at a 1k mana, which is maybe a bit optimistic, but let's say you build this item and you have 1000 mana. In that case, you would have roughly 130 power from the start, so basically what Warlock's Sash or Warlock's Staff ends up with when it's fully stacked. Then you also have 125 mana, a lot less than Warlock's Staff, but you have 15 MP5 to kind of make up for that. What you don't have on Book of Thoth is any kind of survivability, any kind of health, which is one of the core parts of Warlock's Staff. So knowing that Warlock's Staff will give you so much extra health, which is so crucial in a fight and basically changes entirely how you can play or build characters, we would assume that Book of Thoth gets a similar spike from being stacked, right? Well, wrong. Book of Thoth only scales with 3% of your mana and gets extra mana. If we assume that we don't get that much extra mana and we end up around roughly 2k mana at the end with the full stacks because we have 875 extra mana from the item, then we would only end up with 160 power. Sure, this can go a little bit higher. If you really push it, I think you could get to around 3k mana, that it would be at 190 power. That is approximately where it will end though, and that would kind of force you into a bit of an awkward build where you're specifically focusing on mana already. But how did that compete? We got 30 to 60 extra power compared to 600 health. Well, I was talking about how 25 power equals roughly 6 abilities hit in comparison to 100 health. So that should paint a picture here. We are not talking about 10 extra abilities, but more than that to make up for the extra health that the target has as opposed to the extra power that you have. Now, obviously no one really lives that long because the abilities still deal way more damage in the late game, but you see where I'm coming from. And one of the bigger reasons to build Book of Thoth beforehand was that the high power that you get would scale very well with Rod of Tahuti, which also has a lot of power and increases the power that you already have by a lot. With Rod of Tahuti being nerfed, this benefit actually diminishes a fair bit. And Warlock Staff kinda suffers the same fate, but it was never built as a pure power item. It was always built with survivability in mind along with the power. Then we can look at some other items. We, for example, have Soul Gem, 2300 gold, so 350 gold cheaper. 65 power, so already less than Warlock Staff at the start. 150 health, already less than Warlock Staff at the start. And what it makes up for with that is a little bit of extra lifesteal and a little bit of cooldown reduction, as well as the passive, which can be quite impactful. But overall, the base stats on this item are a fair bit weaker, and that's talking about the unstacked version of Warlock Staff in comparison. You have Typhoon's Fang, one of the higher end items right now, which also only has 100 power, which is basically where Warlock Staff is around half stacks. It has 200 mana on top of that, no other survivability except the lifesteal and the passive for that, which increases your power a little bit as well, but at the same time, even Typhoon's Fang often doesn't get more power than Warlock Staff until very late in the game if you're building a lot of lifesteal items. You have Spear of Desolation, 2600 gold, pretty much the same price, starting at 100 power and 15 pen, so you will deal a little bit more damage. But again, it doesn't come with any survivability. It has 10% CDR on top of that, and the passive that works in the favor of CDR, but it's not even remotely close to all the stats that are stacked on Warlock Staff. And for the most important comparisons, let's look at the other items that actually have a little bit of health. Ethereal Staff, 2700 gold, comes in with 90 magical power and 200 health. This is easily outstacked by Warlocks at less than 50 stacks basically. And yeah, you have that nice passive, and yeah, it does have the synergy with Warlock's Staff to some degree, but still it doesn't even remotely compete with new Warlock Staff. Likewise, we have Gem of Isolation with 90 power and 250 health for 2700. A little bit better overall because the stats here are kinda already maxed out a little more, as it doesn't have the same passive as Ethereal for extra damage and has a slow instead, but still not even close, and not even with any mana either. That is another benefit of Warlock Staff, which I'm not even quite sure why it has that much mana, because that again also gives you benefits for building Book of Thoth and actually makes double stacking kind of beneficial at the moment. And then we have Rod of Asclepius, another example for 2600 gold, they're all around the same price. 75 magical power, that's not literally what Warlock Staff is starting with now, and 250 health. So you get 50 health less. You get 50 health less on Warlock Staff at the start, which is compensated for in 13 stacks. I mean, I would think that if you're building a stacking item, you're going to be able to build 13 stacks. Whereas Asclepius, aside of that, has a little bit of movement speed and the healing aura, which honestly is almost comparable to the extra mana. It's a little bit better, obviously, the movement speed. I shouldn't undersell that, but it's not something that is so drastically better on most mages that I would prefer Rod of Asclepius for whatever reason. All these stats combined make Warlock Staff so good now right off the start. That's the crazy part for me. This 75 power start for an item that is super strong when it's fully stacked, and also giving it a higher maxed out power value rather than just turning down the power scaling over time in comparison to it, just strikes me as a very odd oversight. Warlock Staff wasn't bad, it maybe needed changes for the new meta, but if anything, those changes would have been geared more towards the fact that it has 100 stacks at the moment. Turn that down to 75 and give it the same benefits. That would have been a lot more fair in my opinion. As it stands, stacking items become way too valuable. We can basically build Mage's Blessing and Warlock's Staff, and then later on in the build towards the end, Book of Thoth, because you don't necessarily require the stacks of that, and you would still have a very effective, high power build. And that's just not what it should be like. I think stacking items are great and they should have their niche, by completely overboosting them so that they're basically some of the strongest power items in the game, while also providing the strongest survivability and all that kind of stuff at the same time, just feels off to me. And that's not only for Warlock's Staff, we'll talk about Transcendence in the future, and especially Devour's Gauntlet as well. From what I can see so far, I would say that eventually Warlock's Staff is going to be so valued that almost any mage can implement it into their build very, very often. And I kind of hope that's not going to be the case. Even though we have health counter items now, it would be very, very annoying to deal with. Because after all, not everyone has access to those anti-health items, and some gods would really suffer from that. Ability-based assassins. And with that, thank you guys very much for watching. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell, it really helps me out. Other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. Dukesloth, out. So I actually figured out my demonetization issue, and it was my outro. As such, feel free to click any of the links around here right now. There will be new outro music as soon as I find something nice. Until then, as you guys requested, I will do the outro music myself. You're welcome.